So up next, we have Dr. Tanveer Ahmed. He is a psychiatrist, liberal counsellor and author. His most recent book is called, what is it? Fragile Nation, sorry.
Doctor's writing, sorry.
He also contributes regularly to The Spectator Australia.
Thank you. Thanks, Bianca. Now, thanks to all of you for attending, and it's my privilege to attend the stage, especially after such an exciting presence like Daisy, but lovely to meet some other people who I've read before but never actually met in person. I want to give, I guess, a bit of an overview of aspects of my book, which is really about how the world of the psychological sciences may be relevant to the social and political realms of today. And obviously, and identity politics. Now, I want to start by just defining the notion of mental health, which has significance far beyond the realm of health, because it informs our views of human nature. It has wide implications to the realms of, say, the workplace, disability, the law, because it touches on responsibility. For example, the disability pension in Australia has shifted mainly from troubled backs to bad backs to troubled minds. So it's a pointer to how significant mental health is. So mental health is really three disciplines. So one is neuroscience, that we're, I guess, biology, we're physiology, we're a bunch of chemicals and hormones, and that obviously informs what we feel and think. Another is behaviourism. This is that thoughts lead to actions, rewards, punishments, influence behaviour. Think Pavlov's dogs. Many of you will be familiar. The basis of what happens, what psychologists primarily do in the Western world, cognitive behavioural therapy, is rooted in behaviourism. The other is psychoanalysis. So think, I guess, Teutonic, elder, bearded, and that is rooted in the idea that we have a primitive self, often unconscious, of instincts, desires, but that is kind of moderated by this thing we call society. And to our discussion today, I think psychoanalysis is very important, because I think one of the themes that have come out in terms of the deep failure of the commentator class is that, I guess, ordering our mass views around rational individuals making economic decisions, it certainly has its flaws, and it's obviously relevant to a libertarian audience. But also psychoanalysis was a big driver of many of the movements of the 20th century, mainly around the significance of the private, personal realm, which is a deeply Western idea, and desire, the notion of desire, particularly for groups that were previously considered marginalised. And arguably that is critical for the notion. I'll talk a bit more about that, but that goes to the heart of identity politics. Identity politics in some ways is the left taking on some of Freud's ideas or psychoanalytic ideas about unrecognised desire for what might have been considered previously marginalised groups. But what they didn't take into account is that there was a notion of an autonomous self, i.e. the very idea of an individual, that had its own complexities. Or any type of distress that is felt, particularly for non-white male groups, was immediately projected onto the outside, i.e. in patriarchy, capitalism, etc. I'll touch more on that. Now, this notion of mental health then plays out at a time when Western societies have become largely post-religious. So the majority of our population no longer structure their lives around organised religion. And this is where I sometimes joke that I'm a secular priest, that they make sense of their lives through psychology and mental health. So half a century ago, we may have had characters with moral connotations of good and bad, and now we have personalities where the connotation is more about self-presentation. So a lot of morality now comes through the line of mental health. Now, as part of being post-religious, life's project has shifted to one of seeking individual self-fulfillment. And in many ways, many of us were kind of preoccupied trying to, I guess, fine-tune our psychological well-being. And I think there's a huge factor in a lot of what goes on, both at a private and public realm. My book's partly about how groups from other cultures, usually from kind of traditions of family, clan, tradition, are suddenly thrust into the outer suburbs of the Western world and forced to think of themselves as individuals and trying to make sense of their life when a lot of the old structures are essentially crumbling. And again, suddenly so I'll often have people in my room sort of kind of almost novelly having to think that their private personal realm has some sort of significance and what to do with that. Now, another contributor to all of this is obviously the decline of collective institutions, be it political parties, unions, churches. For most of the 20th century, that key battleground of labour and capital, I would argue how a lot of people channel their politics is this kind of, what their stance is between the individual and society. So often as individuals, they're outer markers, what they consume or what food they eat, etc. So there's this line of private distress and public politics that I think drives a lot of politics. And where you sit on that, in terms of the relationship, often determines parts of your politics. So I think this goes to the heart of many of our resentment-based political movements, be it Islamic extremism, radical feminism, white nationalism. All of them have a degree of fact or truth behind them, but are often heavily laced with personal resentments or failures projected onto the outside world. So we've all got a lot of identity politics is built on individual humiliations that latch on to some sort of political resentment ideology. I'd also argue that a lot of our measures of psychological harm, be it abuse, prejudice, or trauma, have been steadily diluted in recent decades. And again, sometimes this is done with good intentions. And you'll see a great book outside of a friend of mine, Gary Johns, talking about public health. A lot of it's done with good intentions, but as a result, we've become increasingly sensitive not only to perceiving psychological harm, but also more likely to attribute the cause of that harm being from our external sources and not from our innate coping vulnerabilities. So an example I relate is the notion of post-traumatic stress disorder, which used to be an objectively life-threatening event. That was really a sudden, unexpected life-threatening event, primarily more. And now it's shifted to become increasingly subjective, which has a huge overlap with the currents of identity politics that essentially elevate personal testimony and subjectivity over reason. And this more broadly, it encapsulates a change in the way we view man in Western societies. And it's primarily limited to Western societies, that we've shifted from framing the human as rather than being innately resilient, to being fundamentally vulnerable. This is a very big shift. And this very much strays in our politics. So we heard from Anthony talking about Aboriginal groups, and it flows right through other minority groups who are increasingly framed as not being able to be reasonable individuals, but are vulnerable, that require regulations and protections and privileges in the public space. Now, in terms of just some tips, something more I want to say about, I think we also live at a time where the notions of human nature are being contested. So there's so much upheaval, but I think our ideas around human nature are also being contested more than ever. Now, I guess I profile several of my patients who might have joined various groups, be it Islamic extremist groups or white nationalists. Some of the themes that come out are their feelings of being discarded, that their local areas no longer recognisable, and obviously unfairly being labelled privileged, and we heard a bit about that from Daisy. But a key thing I've noticed with the white working class is the depths of fatherlessness. So this whole rise of authoritarianism throughout not just the Western world, arguably, but particularly in the Western world, you could argue we've just had a generation, probably more boys have been raised in fatherless families than probably in all of human history. And it's hard not, as me as a psychiatrist, it's very hard not to see the yearning for authoritarian figures as a kind of reach for the primordial father figure. Now, a lot of these patients, they certainly would have had their psychological frailties, but were prone to projecting it outwards, be it their partners, their work, or ethnic groups. My job's often to recognise their distress had significant internal origins, that there was actually something of an autonomous self. That's at a deeper level. And that, again, that's quite a Western idea. Freud and Marx did not get on, exactly because Marx really barely believed in the individual, and certainly not this idea of the autonomous self. As a result, distress people feel of any kind of group not considered privileged is automatically believed by some external power structure, be it patriarchy or capitalism. So some of the people Daisy was alluding to, I look at them and there's so much of a history of individual humiliation, resentments that are often more about them, but then the way they've dealt with that is latching onto a movement, and it's almost, it's their version of therapy, if you like, but it's a very unhelpful one, and that's the way they've decided to cope. Now, back to the working class white male, arguably much of the past half century of progressivism is rooted psychologically in attempting to tame traditional masculinity, which is often referred to as toxic masculinity. This is where Hillary came across as kind of the overbearing headmistress, telling the boys at the back how naughty they were and to sit in the corner. So Trump was that naughty boy and symbolised a kind of blowback of our primitive urges, probably over-suppressed in an era of political correctness. Trump is the Freudian id of Western civilization. And his election is in part a vote for a traditional view of man and his nature, away from the trends of psychology and authenticity. So a little bit more about authenticity. I think that also drives, there's all this yearning for purity. So a lot of the Muslim patients, for example, what they're looking for is some pure version of Islam that sits above what they think are stains of their ethnic cultures, for example. Likewise, you see so many groups trying to find all these movements around food and alternative medicine. Again, in this post-religious society, people are searching for the sacred, notions of purity in all variety of ways. And this is partly why we have such a fractured politics. Now, we're almost out of time, but I'll leave some time for questions. Look, in short, the broad upheaval we are currently enduring extends to views of human nature. People make sense of their lives through the language of psychology, and a great deal of people's relationship to society and their politics also happens through the interface of private distress and public politics. Identity politics is rooted in the recognition of desire, but its failure is in the rejection of the notion of the autonomous self, which is utterly connected to the fundamental ideas in the West of the individual and probably the Christian tradition. Thank you.